Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to explore the complex world of dietary fat, one of the most feared and misunderstood concepts in clinical nutrition. But I'm going to start out with an example. Not all fats are bad. In the case of an athlete that I worked with, he had some real inflammation in joints and was really struggling with some pain. And the solution for him was the essential fatty acid, omega-3 fatty acids. And so all fats are not good and all fats are not evil. So we're going to explore this in this lecture. We're going to look at some essential terminology. We're going to discuss some of the consequences of the types of dietary fats that we consume. And then we're going to finish up with discussing some of the basic functions of fat in the diet. We've got to get some terminology out of the way and some general facts about fat. Fats are also known as lipids, and they are the most energy-dense of all the macronutrients at 9 calories a gram. Carbohydrate has 4, protein has 4, and fat has 9. Now this is true for all fats, whether it's heart-healthy olive oil or lard. So keep in mind when you go to the grocery store and it tells you it's light olive oil, it's not light in calories, it's light in color. All have 9 calories a gram. Now this dietary fat can be visible, things that you can see like mayonnaise, margarine, cooking oil, or invisible, things that are found in muffins and nuts and cookies, desserts and cheese. Many people are surprised to know that nuts are anywhere between 60 and 70% fat. Now chemically, fats are made up of 3 elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These fats are structurally different from one another, and because they are structurally different, they don't behave the same way. Dietary fats are made up of 3 fatty acids stuck or esterified to a glycerol backbone. So if you're trying to imagine this in your brain, it kind of looks like an E, the letter E. And so you can kind of think about, I understand that there's a backbone with 3 prongs sticking out, and those are your fatty acids. Now it's the fatty acid that we really have to explore. Saturated versus unsaturated. Well, what does that mean? Saturated fats mean that in this long fatty acid chain, these long carbon fatty acid chains, that there's no double bond, there's really no space. The whole molecule is saturated. Well, what is it saturated with? What is it full of? It's full of hydrogen ions, and that's going to be an important concept that's going to come back. Now, practically speaking, saturated fats that you can see are hard, they're white, and solid in their visible form. So think about when you go to the grocery store and you're buying that steak and you see that hard white coating on the outside. You now can cue into, aha, that is a saturated fat. Now again, some of that fat is invisible. Coconut oil and palm oil are things that are added on an ingredient list, and the word oil almost makes it sound like you can pour it, but you can't. It's a solid fat, it's a plant-based fat, and when you buy, for example, mint chocolate chip ice cream, the crunchy chocolate pieces in that ice cream actually are made with coconut oil or palm oil because the colder the fat gets, the more solid it becomes. Now certainly again, hiding in foods, there's saturated fat in cheese, chocolate, ice cream, and whole milk. The key point here is that these solid, hard, white fats can raise your blood cholesterol in a predictable fashion. We are all vulnerable to the cholesterol-raising effects of saturated fat. Now, an unsaturated fat. What that means is that there are double bonds that exist between those carbon molecules. There is space. And because these double bonds have space between them, these polyunsaturated fats, that they have double bonds in between, can actually combine with oxygen and become rancid. So we've all had some experience where we've eaten a food with fat in it and it has an off taste. That off taste is rancid polyunsaturated fat. Now, there are some compounds that have only one double bond in that molecule, and that's a monounsaturated fat. They may have 2 or more double bonds, and that's a polyunsaturated fat. So in this case, poly means greater than 2 or more double bonds. Polyunsaturated fat, simple definition. It is liquid at room temperature. It includes corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, and is considered heart healthy, and these fats can actually lower blood cholesterol. But remember, they have that very vulnerable double bond structure. Now, a monounsaturated fat is also liquid in room temperature, but it gets thick or viscous when I put it in the refrigerator, and it can be considered a heart-healthy oil. Certainly the monounsaturated fats are olive oil and peanut oil. And these monounsaturated fats are a key component of that Mediterranean diet that we hear so much about and its heart health benefits. Enter into the scene trans fats. And what are trans fats? We hear a lot about that in the media and the press. Trans fats are unsaturated vegetable oils that manufacturers try to make more solid. And why are they trying to make it more solid? They're trying to make it more solid so it lasts longer in the food. It's less likely to become rancid because there's fewer double bonds. And what they do is make it more solid at room temperature through a process known as hydrogenation. And what this does is they blow hydrogen gas into this unsaturated fat. They add hydrogen to those double bonds, but the consequence is when they are hydrogenating this fat, they are twisting that molecule. They are changing the shape of that fatty acid chain. And remember, shape and structure is going to confer function. Partially hydrogenated fats are what you're going to see on the label. And that's where most of the trans fats are in the American diet. Oftentimes these are foods that are pre-made, and the major contributors of trans fats in the American diet include things like muffins and cookies. Now if you think about it, if I have to preserve the shelf life of a food, if I put a partially hydrogenated fat in it, I'm going to increase shelf life because that food's less likely to become rancid. Well, current research is showing us that these partially hydrogenated, unsaturated fats, trans fats, are just as likely to contribute to heart disease as saturated fat. In fact, some researchers suggest that this fat is the major villain in the development of coronary artery disease. So, since 2006, food manufacturers must list their products' trans fat content on the label. Now keep in mind there's no requirement for trans fats. You need none in the American diet. But the way the labeling law is stated, portions with less than 1/2 gram of trans fats per serving are allowed to be labeled trans fat free. So you got to check the portion on the label. So if I'm a manufacturer and I want to have a trans fat free label, what I can do is just make the portion size smaller to reduce that trans fat content to less than 1/2 gram per serving. So there can be a little trickery here that's going on. Triglycerides are important as another type of dietary fat because more than 90% of the fat or lipid in our body is in this form. Remember, that's 3 fatty acids stuck to that glycerol backbone. Also, most of the fat in food is in the form of triglycerides. Now, I want you to think about this. When we store our extra calories as body fat, and remember, anything that we eat in excess can be stored as body fat, we are storing it in the form of triglycerides. So extra calories, fats, sugar are all going to be stored in the form of triglycerides. Now, sometimes if you've had lots of blood work done in the past, you might be familiar with this term, triglycerides. And we're going to discuss this in more detail in the lectures on heart disease. Now, the word cholesterol is another very familiar term to most of us. Cholesterol technically doesn't contain fatty acids, but it's still classified as a lipid because it has some of the same chemical and physical characteristics as lipids or fat. Now, here's the trick here. It can be consumed. You can consume cholesterol in your diet, but it's also made endogenously, internally by the body, at a baseline rate that varies between 800 and 1,500 milligrams per day. It's made predominantly in the liver, but also in other tissues such as the arteries and intestines. Why does our body need this source of cholesterol? Well, we have this master designed plan that if we absolutely have to have something, oftentimes our body is going to have a way of creating it, i.e. non-essential amino acids. It builds plasma membranes, so cholesterol is going to be part of every cell membrane. It's needed for synthesizing vitamin D, adrenal gland hormones, estrogen, androgens, and progesterone. So it's absolutely an essential part of every cell of your body. It's a key part of bile. It also helps to build tissues and organs during fetal development. But cholesterol has no calories. Because it doesn't have that fatty acid structure, it confers no calories. Now, you can stimulate or turn on the switch to produce cholesterol in your blood, so the endogenous or internal cholesterol synthesis increases with diets that are high in saturated or trans fats. So think about it this way. I've got this substrate coming in, saturated in trans fats, that turns on the switch in my liver, predominantly in my liver, to say, make more blood cholesterol. Endogenous cholesterol synthesis, the amount that's produced in your liver, is almost always enough to meet the body's needs, and therefore there is no dietary requirement for cholesterol. Certainly we might all be familiar with medications that have been on the market maybe for the last 10 or 15 years that lower cholesterol, such as statin resins, and they actually block or turn off that cholesterol switch in the liver. And there are many, many studies suggesting that these statin resins can really reduce the risk of a first heart attack. Now, we also eat cholesterol, and it only comes from animals. So what are our cholesterol-rich foods? Well, first and foremost, we have to understand that it's going to come from any animal product, and it's going to come from meat. So as a quick rule of thumb, for each ounce of meat that you consume, it contains 25 milligrams of cholesterol. Now remember, cholesterol is going to be found in the cell membrane, so it's actually in the flesh of the meat. It's in the flesh of the meat. So for example, you can look up in any nutrition book, and it'll give you approximately the same amount of cholesterol for 6 ounces of chicken versus 6 ounces of brisket. Different saturated fat content, that's true. There's a different saturated fat content, but both of those types of meat have about 25 milligrams per ounce of meat. An egg yolk comes in at about 213 milligrams per egg, depending on the size of your egg. Certainly red meats are going to be a source. Chicken and fish are going to be a source. Organ meats such as brain, kidneys, and liver, significant source of cholesterol. Shellfish, particularly shrimp, is a significant source of cholesterol. And dairy products. And that's full-fat dairy products, not fat-free. So you can get skim milk that's going to have less than 5 milligrams of cholesterol per serving, and then you can get full-fat milk, which is going to be significantly higher. So again, keep in mind that that cholesterol is in the cell membrane, so it's in the flesh of the meat. Foods of plant origin, however, contain no cholesterol. So that reminds me of a marketing strategy with bananas a few years ago, that there was a name brand banana versus a store brand. And the name brand banana had no cholesterol as a little sticker on the label. Now, you're smart enough to know that if cholesterol only comes from animals, why was that on a banana sticker to begin with? Great marketing strategy. It's a great marketing strategy, but the banana had no cholesterol to begin with. The reverse is also true. I can go buy a can of shortening at the grocery store, and it's going to tell me it's cholesterol free. That is true. It's plant, it's vegetable. But is it a hard white fat? The answer is yes. So what does that do to your cholesterol machinery in your liver? Flips the switch on. The challenging part of all of this is that eating cholesterol in the diet, for example eggs, doesn't necessarily translate into an increase in blood cholesterol. So if we're looking at the major switches for endogenous cholesterol production in the liver, it is saturated fat and trans fat. Dietary cholesterol comes in most research a distant third. So you'll read stories in the newspaper that somebody ate 12 eggs a day and they lived to be 105. Well, that's because an egg, rich source of cholesterol, very, very low, negligible saturated fat. So it gets a little confusing when we're talking about this machinery of cholesterol that we eat versus the cholesterol that is made in our liver. Now, you've probably heard of words like low-density lipoprotein, high-density lipoprotein, oftentimes more familiar by their abbreviations, LDL and HDL cholesterol. These terms are terms that many consumers have come to associate with cholesterol and heart health, and we're going to talk about these important blood proteins in a later lecture. But keep in mind, they are blood proteins. They are not found in food. So if you think, okay, I want to go to the grocery store and buy food that has low levels of LDL cholesterol, you can't find that because LDL cholesterol is a blood protein. It is not found in food. Now, what are the functions of fat? Well, certainly it is an energy source, and boy, does it pack a punch. It has 9 calories per gram. That's more than 2 times that from an equal amount of protein and carbohydrate. So think about that from a weight management standpoint. If indeed I'm not controlling the amount of dietary fat from all sources that I consume, then I'm going to end up with more calories than maybe I can tolerate. Certainly we have the protection of vital organs and thermal insulation. Quite honestly, most of us don't need additional thermal insulation, but the protection of the heart, liver, kidneys, spleen, brain, spinal cord from trauma are really pretty significant. Now, in terms of thermal insulation, it's that subcutaneous fat right below the surface of the skin that provides insulation and also protection. You can think about football players. It also can serve as a vitamin carrier and a hunger depressor. Carries vitamins. It is a transport medium, helps to transport those fat-soluble vitamins from the gut into the blood, where they're going to be carried by other transport proteins that we've learned about. So I need to have some dietary fat for the utilization of my fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K. Fat can slow digestion, which helps the body to give it time to absorb nutrients from other food. But keep in mind, in terms of satiety, our most important macronutrient in terms of satiety is going to be protein. It is necessary for the production of many, many regulatory hormones. It's necessary for the production of structural components such as brain development and function. In fact, your brain has such a significant amount of fat that if somebody calls you a fathead, it's actually a compliment. You've got a lot of brain development going on there. Now, what about good fat versus bad fat? As our calorie intake has risen over the past, many extra calories come from these hidden fats and sugars. So where do we stand in the American diet? Well, total fat has actually declined in the American diet, but the average American is still consuming about 15% of total calories as saturated fat. Now, keep in mind, most public health organizations are going to recommend that we keep our saturated fat intake to 10% or less of total calories. In fact, some estimates suggest that it should be in the range of 7 to 10% of total calories. Why is that the case? We want to down-regulate that cholesterol machinery in our liver. In the typical American diet, saturated fat from plant sources comes up at about 34%. Remember, coconut oil and palm oil. Animal sources contribute about the remaining 2/3. So reducing animal protein, especially those with a high fat content, can help you to reduce your total fat, as well as your calories, and your saturated fat. So you need to be a little wary of the types of the fat that you are consuming in your diet. Saturated fat is linked with coronary artery disease, and consequently, health professionals recommend the following: replacing at least some of the saturated fat and all trans fats with non-hydrogenated mono, one double bond, and poly, many double bonds, such as olive oil and safflower oil. Well, how do we accomplish this in a practical way? First and foremost, we can reduce the high-fat animal foods such as ribs and cheese with lower-fat foods such as chicken and fish. I'll give you an example. An 8-ounce ribeye has about 65 grams of fat, where an 8-ounce chicken breast has about 25 grams of fat. So I want you to think about that in terms of the calorie load as well as the amount of total unsaturated fat that you're getting. However, essential fatty acids are fats that fall into two different camps. One are the omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. These fats must be consumed in the diet. Omega-3 fatty acids are highly unsaturated fat. So where does the term omega-3 come from? It's just telling chemists the position of that first double bond in that long fatty acid chain. So it means that that double bond occurs 3 carbons in. Most research studies suggest we don't consume adequate amounts of this fat in our diet. This fat is needed for the production of hormone-like compounds. They're not hormones, but they're like hormones, known as prostaglandins. The specific prostaglandins formed from these omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory, and I want you to think about that like you would think about aspirin. You take aspirin for inflammation, you take aspirin for a headache, you take aspirin oftentimes recommended by your cardiologist for blood thinning. These prostaglandins formed from omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. They confer mostly positive health benefits, and the risks only are associated with excessive intake, which we'll explore. Where are they found in the American diet? Well, they're found in the oils of cold water fish, such as herring, mackerel, sardines, and shellfish. Why cold water? Well, think about what happens. The more double bonds I have in that molecule, the more liquid the fat. The more liquid the fat, the fish that are swimming in that really cold water are not going to have a freezing of that cell membrane. That cell membrane is not going to solidify because that fatty acid is so polyunsaturated. It remains fluid in a very cold environment. Now, you also might have, when you were growing up, I know I did, my grandmother gave me cod liver oil. Cod liver oil, great source of omega-3 fatty acids. That's lost a little favor in current days because cod liver oil can actually have toxins such as mercury and other environmental contaminants. Flaxseed oil also contains these essential omega-3 fatty acids, but it's less powerful than found in fish. Flaxseed contains the omega-3 fatty acid called linolenic acid. It has two N's in it. Where can I get this wonderful omega-3 fatty acid? Well, again, American Heart Association is going to recommend the regular intake of fish, 2 servings per week. And what benefits do we get? Well, we get an improvement in our blood lipid profile. Plasma triglycerides, blood triglycerides lower, and as triglycerides go down, it actually raises the beneficial HDL. There's science out there suggesting it reduces heart disease risk, and it also reduces mortality rates associated with ventricular fibrillation and sudden death. There is science out there supporting its use in the prevention of Alzheimer's disease and any anti-inflammatory disease. So I'm going to remind you, it works in a similar fashion to aspirin. Well, its counterbalance, its opposite, is omega-6 fatty acids. This is a group of fatty acids that tends to be overconsumed in the American diet. It's found in meat, it's found in corn oil, safflower oil, and sunflower oil. It acts in opposition to the omega-3 fatty acids. So what that means is if omega-3 fatty acids decrease inflammation, what would omega-6 fatty acids do? Increase inflammation. The challenge in the American food supply is when we have beef that is corn raised, they are getting a higher percentage of omega-6 fatty acids in their feed, which translates into a higher omega-6 fatty acid content in the meat. Now, there are no firm dietary needs, no firm standards for fat that exist. The American Heart Association encourages people to focus in on replacing those high-fat foods with, again, vegetables, fruit, poultry, lean meat, unrefined whole grains, and fat-free or low-fat dairy products. In addition, they recommend omega-3 fatty acids in fish. What happens if you don't like fish? What happens if you're planning on becoming pregnant and you've read in the media that these cold water fish can accumulate mercury? This is where you can use fish oil supplements. Now, certainly I would always recommend when you take a food compound and put it in a pill that you run it by your healthcare provider. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's a reasonable idea to consume more omega-3 fatty acids, mostly because we've got studies suggesting we don't consume enough, and the health benefits are to balance out those omega-6 fatty acids. American Heart Association and other organizations are also going to recommend a ceiling of no more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day. Remember, we make a wonderful source in our liver. We don't need a dietary intake. Certainly we can take a look at vegetarians, individuals who consume no true animal protein, and their blood cholesterols are lower because they generally have a higher dietary quality. Cut back on the main sources of dietary cholesterol, animal sources that are rich in saturated fats. Do all of that, and again, what we're trying to do is suppress the amount of endogenous cholesterol synthesis that we take in. The American Cancer Society gets a little bit more aggressive and encourages a diet that contains only 20% of total calories from lipids to reduce the risk of certain types of cancer. Cancer of the colon, endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, rectum, prostate, and even possibly breast cancer. Reductions are associated with that less than 20% of calories from fat. I'm going to encourage you, though, the lower we get in that fat content of the diet, it becomes more difficult to do. Some organizations will suggest lowering total dietary fat to 10% of calories. I'm going to tell you that's really very difficult to do unless you're vegetarian. Now, if you have pre-existing heart disease, this is similar to the Pritikin diet, and again, you really are now using your meat or your animal protein as a condiment. You're not using it as an entree anymore. In summary, a prudent recommendation is that 30% of your total calories or less should be from fat, and you really want the majority, 70–80%, being unsaturated fat. Now, certainly we can look at fat deficiencies and excesses. You can have inadequate consumption of fat. You can actually have steatorrhea, which is the malabsorption of fat, and sometimes this occurs for genetic disorders. In individuals who malabsorb fat, or they can't get the fat from the gut into the blood, this can result in severe vitamin states. There's actually a product on the market called Olestra that's in Wow potato chips that actually can cause some fat malabsorption, and fat malabsorption is going to be associated with vitamin deficiencies. Very low fat diets can be associated with gallstones. How does that happen? Well, if you remember from previous lectures, bile is needed to emulsify fat, and if I'm consuming no fat, what happens to the bile? Well, the bile hangs out in its reservoir. It stays in the gallbladder. It can coalesce and form stones. Those being fed IV nutrition, oftentimes when I'm bypassing that gut altogether and I'm feeding directly into a vein, those individuals can develop gallstones at a pretty rapid rate. It's called bile stasis. The bile actually hangs out in the gallbladder too long. Some of the disease states associated with fat excess will actually be discussed in later lectures. So now we get to frequently asked questions. What do I hear all the time? Well, what about those butter substitutes like Smart Balance or Benecol? How can they be good to us? Well, they can be good to us for the following reason. They can actually provide a better balance, i.e. Smart Balance, of the good fats and the bad fats. Oftentimes they try to balance out omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Benecol is actually unique in the fact it has a compound in it called stanol esters, plant stanols, that actually act as cholesterol mimics. So what does that do? That means when you eat a high cholesterol food and you've used Benecol on that food, the Benecol stanol esters actually block the absorption of cholesterol from your gut. They prevent the cholesterol from being absorbed. Why does that happen? Again, they act as a cholesterol mimic. They attach to that receptor on the inside of your gut and prevent the cholesterol that's in that food from being absorbed. Another frequently asked question, are there any health risks associated with omega-3 fatty acids? You've told me the wonders of omega-3 fatty acids. Are there any health risks associated with those? And the answer is absolutely yes. We know, for example, that individuals that consume excessive amounts, and that's why I always encourage, if you're going to do something from a supplement, that you run this by your primary healthcare provider. If indeed they work like aspirin, what do you know about aspirin side effects? Would you take a large dose of aspirin, for example, and go have dental work done? Well, most of the time, if you have a health screening at your doctor's office, what are they going to ask you? Have you had aspirin within the last 3 days? And the reason is it can prevent blood from clotting. So the biggest health risks associated with omega-3 fatty acids are actually the increased tendency to bleed. So again, in my athlete that was consuming omega-3 fatty acids, if he got hit on a Sunday afternoon, a pretty hard hit in football, he could actually end up with a bigger bruise than maybe normally because he was using something that would alter his blood clotting. So there can be some side effects of those omega-3 fatty acids. So again, exercise some caution when you're taking these things as a supplement. So I think those are major strategies. Again, oftentimes the omega-3 fatty acid foods, being cold water fish, can be that source of mercury. And again, if that's something that you're trying to avoid, if you have young children or grandchildren, someone in your family is planning on having a baby, this would be a great example of maybe even staying away from those fatty fish and going to a supplement.